Professor Sarah Bate is the lead researcher in the Centre for Face Processing Disorders at Bournemouth University. She has dedicated her entire career to the study of face blindness and is the author of the book Face Recognition and Its Disorders. Her work is endlessly fascinating to me and is fully deserving of further funding and research, and Sarah and her team of the plaudits they receive. Face blindness, otherwise known as prosopagnosia, is a problem that affects many people around the world. Some of the people who suffer from prosopagnosia know about this condition and the problems it causes in their day-to-day lives, but many more do not even know it is a recognised condition and may not realise that their face recognising ability is somewhat different to most other people. Face blindness is a disorder that often goes under the radar, and for this reason, amongst others, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Sarah Bate onto the podcast. I stumble my words a little bit at the start of this one, so please bear with me as I get my thoughts in order. Professor Sarah Bate, you're a professor, aren't you?
I am.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's okay.
We were just talking about your research into face blindness, and I was about to say that I think it's maybe shared more widely than some of the research that goes on in the university. I mean, I know you've put almost your entire career into studying this, haven't you? Maybe I should step back there and just say, can you give us an introduction into what face blindness is and what you know about it?
Sure. So face blindness has an official medical term, if you like, which is prosopagnosia. And that basically translates from the Greek, where prosop means face and agnosia is a loss of memory for. And traditionally, so for, say, 150 years, we knew that some people can acquire prosopagnosia. So by that, I mean they had previously completely normal face recognition skills, but after some sort of brain injury, they received some sort of damage to a key face recognition area of the brain, which is about here, just above your right ear, if you're interested, called the fusiform face area. And when that area becomes damaged, severely damaged, people lose the ability to recognise faces. So in really severe cases, it might actually be a case of somebody waking from a coma to not knowing who that person is in front of them when they see them just by the face. So it might be their spouse, a family member, somebody they absolutely should recognise, but they lose that ability. Often when the person begins to speak, they will then realise who it is, because the condition's very much about just a disorder of face recognition. It's not about voice recognition or general loss of memory for who the person is. It's actually an inability just to recognise the face. And from the sort of brain injury perspective, that's quite a rare condition, fortunately. So we don't come across an awful lot of people who have that. But what's become widely known in the last 20 to 30 years or so is there's actually a developmental equivalent of this condition, which we refer to as developmental prosopagnosia. And this just seems to affect people from, the typical population, as we like to say as psychologists, people who have got no reason to not recognise faces. They've never received a brain injury. They don't seem to have any other condition that's going on alongside their difficulties with faces. So it's not at all a psychiatric condition or an intellectual condition. It's not even what we describe as a very low-level visual condition. These people don't need glasses or some sort of visual correction. They just have seemed to have struggled with faces for most, if not all of their lives. What we do know is in some instances that can travel in families. So sometimes we can look to see genetic evidence, if you like, as in there's some family connection to the condition, but that doesn't seem to be the case for everybody, and no specific gene has been identified. So for some people that might be the case, but other people just seem, for some reason, just to not develop normal face recognition skills. And there's a lot of debate in the academic literature at the moment as to how do you actually define who has this condition. And depending on where you want to sort of put your diagnostic cutoff, you'll get a different, what we call a prevalence rate in terms of how many people experience the condition. Often you'll see the figure of 2% thrown around, which is 1 in 50 people, which seems remarkably high. Other estimates are actually even higher if we allow for a slightly more liberal inclusion criteria. So what we do know is probably quite large numbers of people do experience this everyday difficulty with faces.
Wow. And I'm relatively familiar with this idea of face blindness now because I've done some of your studies, which was very interesting. And I don't know if you remember or realise, but when I was a student here, I also was part of making a film for prosopagnosia. I don't know if you knew that.
I think we've talked about this in the past, actually. Yeah.
So I'm relatively familiar with it. So it doesn't seem like as much of a wow thing to me anymore. But I remember when I first heard about it, I thought, wow, I didn't realise this was ever even a thing. So perhaps a lot of people who are listening or watching this podcast will wonder the same thing and think, how does this propagate? And and maybe there'll be some people listening who actually recognise this in themselves. They think, actually, yeah, I'm not very good at recognising faces. But is there, like you say, is there a definitive sort of cut-off point to what you determine as face blindness versus someone who is just not as good as others at recognising faces?
Yeah.
How do you determine that?
Well, there's a debate surrounding that, and there's different schools of thought on whether what we're actually seeing here is some form of continuous ability. So in the same way, I could put everybody in the population in order of how good they are at, say, maths, at times tables or something. We could do the same for face recognition ability. And some people would make the case that those who are just at the very end of that natural continuum of ability just happen to be those that we're putting a label on as having this condition, face blindness or developmental prosopagnosia. Now that becomes slightly more complicated when we know that we have got an existence of some people who have a very pathological version of this condition, are acquired prosopagnosics. So
what do you mean by that? Sorry, pathological?
So by pathological, we mean a very clinical, a very definitive disorder. So an actual different group to the rest of the population.
So do you mean the head injuries? Is that what you mean by that?
The head injury, because they've actually had some actual brain damage. We can actually, this is where this word pathological comes in, we could actually look at a brain scan of these people and say, they've got brain damage, they've lost what they could do before. They are, acquired prosopagnosia tends to be very severe. It's very striking if somebody, as I previously said, awakes from a coma and suddenly that ability that was there has gone.
That's a very black and white one, isn't it? Yeah. Before they could recognise faces, now they can't.
Absolutely. So you've sort of got these people over there and the rest of the population over here. Now, with the developmental form, it's not quite that straightforward because we haven't found a gene. We're not. There's not really been any studies that have consistently found an unusual pattern of anything going on in the brain of people with developmental prosopagnosia that we could say, well, there is a biological underpinning to this. Actually, there's quite mixed evidence about what might be typical and what might not be. And certainly no firm conclusions there. So it's much more difficult to say, well, these people deserves probably the wrong word. We should treat these people as being in a very distinct group and putting a label on them as we do for people who might experience ADHD or autism or dyslexia. Even.
Are they examples of ability continuums, as you say? 'Cause I like that phrase. That's not one I've
Yeah, so some of them, before. Again, the jury's still out there on several of these, more so the cognitive conditions. I mean, with autism, you'll see all sorts of different hypotheses about the genetics that contribute to that particular condition. With developmental prosopagnosia, the difficulty is as well is how we use different assessment tasks to actually identify the core impairment. So most people will come to see us here at the university because they experience difficulties recognising people they know. So if you think about everyday life, if you feel you're very good at face recognition, you might be reflecting on how you recognise your colleagues, how you recognise your family, and so on. You're not very often in a situation, unless you work for the police or some sort of forensic agency, where you're forced to make really difficult face recognition judgments about faces you don't know at all.
Or unless you do one of your studies like I did. Yeah,
absolutely.
So what you're saying is usually it's other parameters that you might be using other than just face.
Yeah, I think that's the concern, is people come to see us because they're not recognising their wife or their husband or their kids or their mum or their dad. And then they come into the lab and we test them for prosopagnosia. And we give them quite abstract face recognition tests. So we give them tests like you've just mentioned of what we call their unfamiliar face recognition ability. So rather than testing them of that everyday context, why are you failing to recognise people we know you really should know, we're asking, why are you not recognising faces that you're not connected to? And that's very different to the real world experience of face recognition. And this is very much coming out in the literature now, into this sort of debate, are we using the right assessment tasks? So what I could do instead, and what we do actually, is we do run famous face recognition tests. And you could say, well, that's actually a lot more linked to everyday familiar face recognition. There are some issues there, of course, because people might not have had adequate exposure to certain faces in the media, and
culturally dependent.
Yeah, very much so. But it's actually, on the whole, it's pretty good what we get there. But most people perhaps don't do that, and they do rely on these very quick to administer unfamiliar face recognition tests. And we often find people come to us who say, I'm having these really severe difficulties in everyday life, but they actually perform relatively well on some of these assessment tasks, and there may be different reasons for that. It might be they're very good at just focusing on one particular feature of the face and hanging on to that, which a lot of people with prosopagnosia actually do, because they develop these very elaborate compensatory strategies to get themselves through everyday life. And it might just be that their strategies are better than the tests we've got at the moment. So this is a really key challenge that's facing the field at the moment, is, are we using the right tests, and are we actually understanding face blindness in the right way? Because we're not doing our job very well as researchers if people are coming to see us about problems with recognising people who should be familiar to them, but we're testing them on faces that they have absolutely no meaningful connection to, on those that they've never seen before.
But you also say they perform relatively well when it's the more abstract faces that they shouldn't necessarily know. Is that what you mean?
Some people do. Well, some people will come in and, of course, and do poorly on all of them, as expected. And those are sort of the simpler ones to deal with. The more challenging ones are where people say, I'm really not recognising those people I should do in my everyday life, but I'm doing okay on your tests. And sometimes I give a reason for why they're doing so well on the tests, and it will be something like, I can hold a face in my mind just for a few minutes, or I'm able just to focus in on one feature and use that. But it's more about the longer term encoding of faces, and how those are perhaps laid down or access to.
So it could be like a short-term memory versus sort of longer-term memory type difference in people as well.
Absolutely, which raises the question of whether there's actually different subtypes of the condition. So it might be, for some people, it's a very early on issue with face perception, if you like. So there's just something about the way that they're looking at faces. So faces never get stored. For some people, it might be they're actually able to look at them correctly, store them correctly, but they can't then retain that information or access it
later.
That's
I see.
it.
How does this affect? You must have heard a lot of stories from people's lives that have this condition. How are they affected by this? How does it impact their lives?
We hear quite a wide range of stories. So some people will tell us they've learnt to live with it, because often we meet people who we diagnose in midlife, often in the 40s or 50s, and bearing in mind they've lived with it for their whole lives and they haven't actually known anything different. So these people tend to be very different to our acquired prosopagnosics, whose it's just an absolute shock to lose that ability, and you have to learn to do something differently to how you've always done it. For the developmental prosopagnosics, often we hear something quite different, where they'll say, well, I didn't actually realise until I was an adult that other people use the face to recognise people. And that's a genuine reflection. And I've always used hairstyles, I've always used the voice, I've always used posture.
That's always the problem with the subjective human experience, is that we don't know how other people are experiencing things, do we?
Absolutely.
And I can't think of an exact example right now, but I've reflected at points in my life and I go, what is that, how everyone else does it, or whatever, for other things, but I think that's probably one of the hardest things about the research you're doing as well, is the subjective nature of each individual and how they've experienced it.
And that really comes out where often as researchers we talk about this severity of the disorder being on a continuum. So some people feel you often hear, well, I'm a bit bad with faces, but I'm probably not as bad as most of the people you meet. And then you test them and they get an, absolutely bottom score. And they're like, oh, okay. And you talk to them and you realise they've worked out ways to deal with it, to cope with it, to get around it. So the common one is context. People use contextual clues quite a lot to identify people, and they're sort of just thrown off their game when they meet someone very unexpectedly in a place where they'd never normally see them.
Is that what you specifically mean by contextual? It's the geographical location that they normally see that person?
Absolutely, So, if it's, well, we're at work, this person's normally hanging around the coffee shop and they've got this particular hairstyle. Most people can work from A to B to C, if you like, to work out who that person is. We do meet some people who the condition has actually had really profound consequences in everyday life too. And often these are quite sad. And you hear stories about how it's actually interfered with somebody's employment goals, career goals, if you like. We've had a lot of teachers who have left the teaching industry, because
they struggle to remember student
Absolutely,
spaces,
and you often hear the old seating plans in classrooms the other way around that, but then they have stories of how kids have caught on to what their difficulty with faces is and how they've sort of switched around without them knowing. And
kids are so mean.
They are. Social anxiety, all sorts of different things. I think when people have been in very awkward circumstances where they haven't recognised or identified somebody who perhaps is really important to their career, their boss. And then, of course, you get the romantic side of it. People who've got all sorts of stories about dating and how they've walked up to the wrong person after, popping to the loo during a date and so on, and all sorts of stories there. But the ones that always...
I just imagine their date instantly gets up and leaves.
Absolutely. There's lots of stories. And, a lot of them are amusing, but some of them are incredibly sad. And I think the most moving ones are always the ones we hear about children with prosopagnosia. And because the condition isn't that well known about, much better now, I suppose, than it was when I first started looking at it. But schools wouldn't necessarily be particularly tuned into the condition. Once they realise a child might experience prosopagnosia, they'd obviously be very motivated to go and find out more. But the consequences in terms of social isolation, peer learning, team sports, it's quite endless, particularly for younger children. And some of the stories that we hear there, you do reflect on as a researcher, and it's certainly prompted some of the lines of research that we've gone down in terms of, can we actually help children? Can we improve how we can identify children with face blindness more through behavioural symptoms as opposed to the testing side? Because some of these kids are, they're too young really to put them through a battery of objective face recognition tests, if you like. So it's more about what are the outward symptoms of it. And can we help them? Because the other side to it, of course, is if we can improve face recognition skills, we actually want to do that as early in life as possible, because we know as psychologists that that's where the brain will actually be more open to improvement and training, and that sort of window closes as people get older.
A bit more elastic, the brain.
That's
is
it.
That a true thing? Is that true?
Yeah. Different for different cognitive processes to where or how long exactly. But the general rule of thumb is the younger you can get into to try and address something, the better the chance of success.
So do you think it potentially is a technique problem that could be solved? It's something that most of us take for granted, how we maybe scan a face to memorize it, and people with this condition perhaps aren't doing that, or something like that? Is that...
It's probably not as simple as that. I think we probably all do recognise faces in different ways, and there's multiple stages to the face recognition process as well, where it could actually break down, which we sort of touched upon a little earlier in the conversation. So it could be in the way people are just looking at faces or scanning faces, as you said. It could be that it's more about actually attaching some meaning. So some semantic meaning, the name, the context, how I know this person, what do they like, what do they dislike. If you think about all the information that we instantly access, as soon as I see you, everything I know about you is available to me if I go searching for it.
That's a scary thought.
But it's just there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm looking at your face and I'm judging how you're feeling at this moment in time, what your intentions are. Do you look well? Do you look unwell? All that information is just there in a click of a finger. But it's probably not for some people. And it's about understanding which part of that process is actually breaking down during recognition. Is it that I know, for example, you're familiar to me, but I just can't get to knowing who you are? And that's very different to somebody else who might not actually get any familiarity information at all and thinks, well, actually every face, it looks like a stranger. Whereas somebody else might actually get through the familiarity stage. They might even get some semantic and biographical information, but they just can't get to the name. And that, again, that's something very different. So that is the challenge, is there's never going to be one straightforward answer to why different people are experiencing this condition. What we also know from what the studies we've done and other studies that are out there is people aren't having that much success in improving face recognition skills. So it's not like there's probably going to be a magical answer out there. We might be able to do bits to support it. Some of the work we've done has actually not been just about face training, so not trying to sort of restore or put back or add the missing skill, but actually just to say, okay, so you haven't got that ability. Let's look at different ways at which we can circumvent this problem. So can we just teach you some different ways to behave in social situations, which will help you avoid that awkwardness or might help you to get by in 8 out of 10 situations and so on. And generally speaking, we get better feedback on taking that approach than we do necessarily on getting people to do hours of face training, which we have done. And we've had some limited success, but it's by no means,
I wonder if the other problem with that, I've had physio a lot in the past, and they give me exercises to do, and you go home and you think, you think, oh, when am I going to find time to do these exercises, sort of thing? And then you go back and they ask, how did you get on with your exercise? You go, yeah, great. do you think that might be the case when you set these tasks?
Possibly. I'd say the people we work with tend to be highly motivated.
Okay.
So
that's what they tell you.
That's what they tell us. We also pay them quite well.
Oh, that helps.
Which helps. But I guess a lot of the work so far has been done with quite small cohorts of people as well. We've done some work with kids where we had quite a lot of fun during lockdown, actually, and we used the childhood game Guess Who? I don't know if you play that with your family.
Yeah, I think we've got a rip-off version of it.
Yeah,
it's not called Guess Who, it's called like Who Am
Are
I?
You
or something.
Yeah, we adapted that game and changed the faces within all the little flip windows so that they differed by very small amounts to each other. So it wasn't about, if you remember with the classic game, it's more like cartoon faces, and you've got boys and girls and long hair and short hair. Are they wearing glasses? Have they got blonde hair or brown hair? In our version, all the external sort of cues to recognition were identical, and they were having to ask questions like, are the eyes close together? What's the distance between the nose and the mouth, and so on.
That sounds hard.
And it gets progressively more difficult. And we ran this with quite a big group of typical children, and we had some really promising results there. We did get an improvement in face recognition skills after 2 weeks of training. And then we rolled it out to adults, and this was adults with face blindness, and this was during the first COVID lockdown, when people had an awful lot of time on their hands, and we were posting all this out to people, and we had families all over the country sort of playing Guess Who with our modified game. And we had another group of people with face blindness who just played the classic version of Guess Who, so just the with the cartoon faces.
So they were the control group.
They were the control group, and we had a lovely difference between the two groups, and we tested their face recognition skills before and after. So we did get some improvement. It did actually disappear when we got them to stop training, and we left it a month, and we went back and tested them again, and then we started to see a bit of drop off.
Right. So was the improvement when you measured before and after, was that a different test, or was that on the it wasn't on the Guess Who game?
No,
it was on a different
so the Guess Who game is just the training exercise, if you like, and we were using our diagnostic measures of face blindness as the before and after. So there were some promising results there, but they're not life-changing results, as in as I say, we're not restoring people to what you might call a normal face recognition ability. And I guess, there's a whole career's worth of work there left to be done on where you go next with that. But, it's interesting, because I think the same as with many different cognitive conditions, you sort of meet people who say, well, why would I want to change as well? You get some people who are just happy as they are, and a fair number of people with face blindness will say that. I've lived with it for all these years so far. I don't want to change. It's part of me. And
that's fair enough.
Yeah,
I suppose,
they like to contribute to the research, but it's not necessarily about finding, I hate the word cure, but, or finding the answer to it. But they do enjoy sort of contributing more to the research process in terms of understanding the condition.
Do you think that once people know, having that sort of sense that there's a label for this thing, does that help people, do you think, as well? I've often wondered, there's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy thing, isn't there? I think that with children who are diagnosed with ADHD, for example, is that diagnosis actually going to help them in the long run, or are they just now saying, I'm ADHD, I can't do this because I've got ADHD or something? Do you know what I mean? Is it a positive thing in your opinion?
Yeah, I think there's probably two parts to that. I think, first of all, many people we meet do report that initial sense of relief at having, if you want to use the word, a diagnosis, having a label put on it, that there's other people out there that are the same as them. It's not just them that are different. And that's definitely a common theme. I think the second part to that question is then, well, how can I then use that information to make life better for me, in the same way people with other, if we want to use the word disabilities, that can protect you under the Equality Act, for example, or if you have dyslexia or ADHD, you can bring proof of that to a higher education establishment such as this, and that would be recognised and you would be protected under that. What do people get in terms of actually having prosopagnosia? Well, we come back to this issue of awareness and the fact that many places, many people wouldn't actually know what the condition is, if you presented with that. And time will address that. It still needs to very much get out there. There needs to be more education around that. But that's very much the feedback we're still getting, is other people haven't heard about it. Recent years, I think it's come on a long way, because it has been featured in the media. There's been all the stories surrounding Brad Pitt, for example, having face blindness, Stephen Fry. Yeah, there's been some quite prolific celebrities who have come forward and said they have the condition. And it has been in the media a fair amount. I mean, we've certainly done our share of pushing that on over the last decade or so. But of course, there's much more to do.
How many other places are researching prosopagnosia?
So there's a very active group in America that we work quite closely with as well, and we collaborate with.
Whereabouts is that?
So this is at Harvard. So there's a great group there led by Joe DeGutis, and we have quite regular conversations and link up on various projects, and a lovely group of researchers over there. There's been some interest in Australia over the years. Some other laboratories in the UK have also sort of come in and out of investigating prosopagnosia as well. I think the pandemic has done what it's done to everything pretty much, in terms of probably ramping the volume down of research activity, which is a concern for those of us in the field, because it was a very vibrant community before the pandemic.
Right.
But again, I think that's our job as as leaders in the field, is to actually try and push that back, get more people interested in it again.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, I think, to me personally. What about people who have had these brain injuries then? I mean, how common is that, first of all? How many people, roughly speaking, have... What did you call it? Acquired
prosopagnosia.
Yeah.
It's very rare. It's so rare we don't, I couldn't put a statistic on it as we do for developmental prosopagnosia.
But you've worked with some people who have...
Yeah, we get... hundreds of people have reached out to us. Although that sounds a lot in terms of an overall prevalence rate in the population. It's very, very small.
Yeah, of course,
yeah. But...
And is it just faces as well? Is it... Are there other, particularly with acquired prosopagnosia, do they have other side effects?
It would depend on the nature of the brain injury. So if you think about, I've pointed to this spot here, just above my right ear.
Yeah.
When somebody has a massive brain injury, a really severe brain injury, it's not going to be very often it's localized to just this tiny spot of the brain. And there's other brain areas around that face recognition area, which are responsible for all sorts of other cognitive functions as well. So very often you will see problems with object recognition as well. It's not just about faces.
And is that the same for developmental prosopagnosia, that people have object recognition?
Sometimes,
Okay.
sometimes.
Right.
Which again...
Because I was going to... Sorry to interrupt. Because I was going to ask, what is special about the face? But carry on with what you were saying.
And I was going to say navigational difficulties. We know, the brain surrounding those sorts of brain areas are also responsible for navigation. So you often see that. It's very rare with acquired prosopagnosia that you actually find what we call a pure prosopagnosic, where it is only faces. And it's for that very reason that a brain injury, a severe brain injury, is normally quite large, and the lesion is quite large. And it's really interesting because if you go back through the medical literature, the time when acquired prosopagnosia sort of really came out was during war. And it's when soldiers returned from trench warfare. So we're talking World War I and into World War II as well. And you can imagine the number of soldiers returning with all sorts of different injuries, brain injuries, all sorts of different types of impairment and presentations. And this was actually the key timing in the literature when they actually sort of coined this term, prosopagnosia, and it was surrounding all the soldiers returning from war, where there was actually, for the first time, a concentrated number of people that were coming forward with those sorts of injuries. And then over the years, they've tended to be very small case study series on acquired prosopagnosia. You tend to not have too many people available, and those that you do have might have such a mixed medical presentation that it might not make sense to just explore one avenue with them. If you ever do find somebody whose problem is mostly just restricted to faces, I think from a researcher's point of view, they're gold dust. And they could tell you so much. Right. Such a powerful window into the human brain from that approach.
I mean, would you agree that we just know so little about the human brain still to this day?
Yeah. Yeah.
It is interesting the way, you were pointing at this area of the brain as face recognition. I mean, it seems to me, but this is perhaps the view I've now got of how the human brain works, is that you could separate out every bit of the brain and say this is for that task. Is that it feels like it's oversimplistic to me.
Yeah.
And yet I have heard that a lot, this area does this frontal lobe does this, etc.
I mean, again, there's different schools of thought here, and you'll have different academics arguing about this, forever.
It's the same thing as well with sorry, I keep kicking my mic stand. Not very professional for me, is it? I have the same thing with genetics as well. When people identify a particular gene, I think, is it really that simplistic? Because why would genes follow the same sort of we've labelled something with a word. What has a gene got anything to do with that word that we've given to something? Anyway, sorry, carry on.
And I think the same perspective can be put onto genetics as it can to the brain areas. Yes, those individual brain areas we know mostly support this one thing. They do others as well, but mostly do this thing. But they have to work together with a number of other brain areas to actually successfully complete a process. So although I'm saying this area here is responsible for face recognition, of course, part of the process starts with the eyes and works through, the visual areas of the brain before it gets to there. And then that area needs to interact with areas which are responsible for long-term memory storage. Some of that will be the visual storage of the visual representation. Some of that will be the storage of what we've talked about, all the biographical information, the name information. And that's not all held within this one spot here. It's about how they all work together. And it could equally be the case that all of those brain areas that are responsible for this overarching process of face recognition are intact, but they might not be linked up and doing their job together properly.
So that
and
really
you could say that
complicates
for genetics as well.
That reassures me that you've said that, because I've always heard people saying, this area does this. I think, how can it be that simple? And as you say, there's multiple tasks that are required for any given thing that we label as a task in the real, in our world.
Yeah, and I think for faces, the most remarkable thing about that is that we recognise a face in a split second. It's quicker than a split second. It's I know who that person is. I just know. I look at you. I know who you are. But that doesn't reflect how much of my brain has had to work together to pull all that information. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not just that information. It's given me this live information about how you're feeling today, what you're feeling this second, what your emotional expression is at this particular moment in time. It's changed now. And that is just so absolutely remarkable.
It's phenomenal, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that shows you how, any part of that process could break down and result in the same outward behavioural symptom of a failure to recognise somebody. But of course, it could be any part of all of those things that are happening together.
And the brain is sort of malleable, right? So it develops over time as well. So I guess there must also be something going on with the more you see a person, perhaps the pathways in order to access that information about that person become strengthened, and so that process gets quicker when you recognise some, like your husband or wife or something you see every day. Will that then potentially change how the brain is working in terms of accessing that information because it's now got a shortcut to it, sort of thing?
Yeah, so again, there's different schools of thought here, with some people putting forward the case we're actually born with our face recognition ability. So that is all in place from birth. Which
again, that's another mind-blowing thought for me, that we've got these instincts, that we just know to do.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, others believe, well, okay, we might have some sort of attentional bias at birth which makes us particularly interested and drawn to faces, but it's actually the experience with faces which makes these areas refine and become specialised for face recognition, and then start to come online to start working together. So again, two very different approaches and two very different schools of thought, and we don't necessarily know which is right. As with most things, it's somewhere in the middle. I'm sure.
Yeah. It's always grey, isn't it? It's never the black and white that some people want it to be. So what you're suggesting is that with the second one you said was that basically we have a series of instincts that just so happen to match up nicely with how we recognise faces as well. Is that what you...
Yeah, and there's all sorts of evolutionary explanations for how that happens. I mean, if you think about where a mother holds an infant to breastfeed, well, it's actually right there, which happens to be the optimal place for the infant to view the mother's face and start to get experience with the face there.
Very true.
So if you speak to an evolutionary psychologist about the different perspectives on how face recognition develops, there's all sorts of reasons why we might be pre-specified to recognize faces, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone will reach their full capability. So there's some interesting work out there, for example, which says people who live in smaller towns or who grew up in small villages don't actually have as good face recognition ability as people who've had exposure to many more faces.
For some reason I thought it would be the other way around. I thought that because they have just a small number of faces to remember, that they then can do that more successfully or something. But
no, so the finding's the other way around. Right. And there's also stories about neglected children, so children who've been brought up without much social contact, children in orphanages and so on, who haven't had much interaction with large numbers of people. When they're tested later on in life, they haven't developed full face recognition ability. And interestingly, the same seems to extend to emotional expression recognition as well. So it definitely seems to be this value of exposure to different aspects of face perception, and it's not just about facial identity recognition.
Has the breastfeeding thing been looked into as well? Whether that plays a part? As you say, that looking up at the mother from an early age, if you weren't breastfed, are you more likely to be...
I'm not aware of anyone who's looked at breastfeeding versus non-breastfeeding. I guess if you're bottle feeding, you may also tend to hold the infant in the same place, so it could be confounded. So no, I'm not aware of any.
It'd be difficult to do that one out on retrospect, wouldn't it? Yeah. I hadn't thought about the bottle thing. I should know that as well. Wow. So, where do we go from here? Should we have a look at your images that you've brought
sure.
in? So what is this first one? For those watching on YouTube, you can also watch on Spotify, by the way. A little plug there. What is this? You're giving a talk. Is this the NHS, you said?
So this was at the Houses of Parliament. So we're in Westminster there. This was in summer 2014. And we held a breakfast meeting in the House of Commons where we were trying to raise awareness about face blindness. And the sort of longer term goal was for that to bring about some policy change and for the condition to be actually recognised by the NHS. So we had various sort of stakeholders. We had some MPs there. The British Psychological Society were there, the Encephalitis Society, who have many members who acquire prosopagnosia after encephalitis, which is basically infection of the brain.
I was going to ask what is encephalitis, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow,
yeah.
Okay.
So various charities were there. People who have face blindness themselves joined us. And we basically presented the work here that we're doing here at BU. We made an awareness video at the time as well, which we played, and that's still on our website actually, if anyone wants to have a look at that. And it was a really successful meeting. And a couple of days later, we found out that face blindness was going to be featured in the NHS A to Z of conditions, which was really nice for us, and we were able to help them develop their information page on the NHS Choices website.
Wow.
And they link back to us here at BU as the recommended place you can come and get assessed if you think face blindness affects you.
Wow. So like a fantastic achievement and a milestone, would you say, in your research?
Definitely. And not just in research, but I think just in professional, in my career. More generally than just research, it was sort of wider than that, I think, because, we meet so many people who have face blindness, and often it feels like a one-way relationship where these people help us with our research. Our participants are absolutely our bread and butter. They facilitate us to do what we do. They give us their time. And this was an opportunity for us to actually help them and to do something back. And it was a really profound day and certainly a moment, to remember.
We'll stick it up on the wall in a minute. So what was I going to say about that? Yeah, I think that's just like an amazing example of what research can do when you're persistent with a thing and you just continue plodding away, and how that can have real sort of societal impact. That's quite a major thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
To me, it seems like
was
a really
major
thing. Yeah.
And I think our research is often very focused on cognitive psychology, on understanding the brain, on understanding prosopagnosia. It's not so much about how many people know what prosopagnosia is. We're not doing that sort of research, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So this is quite a leap from our everyday business. We are very much people in the lab trying to understand what's going on in this condition, as opposed to healthcare inequalities or the more social side of things. So this was something really quite outside the box for us as well. But it was important that we did that.
To have some real sort of social impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And the other image that we've got here today is the front cover of your book, Face Recognition and Its Disorders, by Sarah Bate. That's how old is that now?
So that was published in 2012.
11 years old.
Yeah, so I should update it, shouldn't I? That's a job. Write the second edition.
Yeah, do you think that there's enough new information to do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, if I can find some time and a publisher, then that should definitely be done.
Well, who published this one?
That was Palgrave-Macmillan, that one.
Oh, fabulous.
So, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, that's something that's quite close to my heart, because I finished writing that book while I was pregnant with my first child, my daughter Ava. So the acknowledgement that's just inside the front cover is actually it's dedicated to her, and I think it says for Ava, who grew within me while this book was written. And she loves that, and she's always taking the copy of the book to show people that it's dedicated to her, and she often takes it into school to show her teachers, and she really likes that, and that's lovely for me as a mother.
That's amazing. That must feel so great.
It does. I don't tell her the stress that went on with actually getting a book finished before she arrived, but I just about made it.
Right. And, hopefully that inspires Ava or her friends or something to consider doing a similar thing with their lives, or
I hope so.
Publishing a book or something.
Yeah.
The reason I say that is, this is a much smaller scale to what you've done, but I wrote a children's book recently, and I got 20 copies printed for like friends and family and things. And Charlotte was adamant just last week that she wanted to take one into school, so she wrote to Mrs. McHugh, her teacher, and said, this is for you. And Mrs. McHugh then read it to the class, and apparently they all applauded at the end, and it just
how lovely.
Yeah, and that's also I wrote inspired by, it's called There's Something in My Shoe, because when Charlotte was younger, every time we went out for a walk, she would get something in her shoe, which made me think, how do things actually get into people's shoes in the first place? So I wrote a little rhyming story about this thing that's actually got feet.
Sounds like the next Gruffalo to me. I think you need to get this out there.
It's a little bit like that, yeah. It's a nice chance for me to plug it on the podcast too.
Definitely.
But no, it filled me with joy, really, that Charlotte firstly wanted to take it to show her teacher, and then that she read it and all the children applauded, and after that some of the parents came up and said, hey, I heard you wrote a book, because the children obviously then went home and told their parents, hey, Charlotte's dad wrote a book. So it's all that stuff. It's just amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
As I say, a much smaller scale than what you
you never know. You never know, this could go places.
So what sort of things are in face recognition and its disorders that we haven't already spoken about? Is there any more depth to this?
So it was designed to be an academic textbook. So back when I wrote this, I started as a lecturer at BU in 2010. So it was my first lecturing position. And I was asked to develop a final year undergraduate unit called Face Recognition and Its Disorders. And one of the things I very quickly realised was there was no supporting book for the students. So this actually mirrored the way in which I delivered the course. And it really takes people through what we know about typical face recognition, the theories behind it, what happens when that breaks down, as in acquired prosopagnosia, and of course the developmental form of face blindness, but also other developmental conditions where face recognition difficulties can also be a symptom. So it's by no means a pure version of prosopagnosia, but For example, many people with an autism spectrum condition can experience difficulties with faces. So it goes through those other sorts of disorders as well. Majorly outdated now, but it does talk about attempts to treat prosopagnosia and so on, and the literature obviously has jumped on in 10 years immensely.
Were you more optimistic about treating prosopagnosia back then when you wrote the book? Because you mentioned you weren't. You always knew it was a losing battle. Maybe.
Yeah,
maybe that's the wrong phrase. Sorry, not a losing battle, but a hard fight.
It's certainly worth exploring and keeping going with that. You just obviously have to moderate expectations, which we do. To all research participants, this probably isn't going to change your life and suddenly give you amazing face recognition skills, but it could be a stepping stone on that journey, however long that might take, if it did ever happen. So yeah, that was what the book was about, and it goes through how, again, the assessment of difficulties as well. Although it was designed as a textbook, I know I've had messages from lots of practitioners as well, so educational psychologists, clinical psychologists who have gained something from the book as well.
Fantastic.
And people with face blindness themselves have enjoyed reading it. So
wow.
Yeah.
So it really is the Bible on face blindness, prosopagnosia. I'll say it for you. Yeah, let's be sensationalist here.
You're very kind.
There's another fascinating side to this that I wanted to talk to you about, which is the opposite end of this spectrum. You call them super recognizers.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you test for that as well.
We do.
And am I allowed to say that your husband was a super recognizer?
Yeah, he'll love the shout out. Yeah.
Which I find amazing that, because only a very small proportion of people get classified as super recognizers as well, and you live and have done for many years
and never knew it.
Yeah, right under your nose.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about super recognizers and the opposite end, and what how that helps you with face blindness, maybe or maybe not.
Yeah. So the original intention when we set out to look at super recognizers was actually to further our understanding of prosopagnosia or face blindness, because coming back to this idea of whether face blindness is a condition or whether we're just looking at people who tend to be the bottom end of a typical distribution. If that's true, you then would expect to have people at the top end who are equally as good as these people are bad.
Yep.
Follows.
Makes sense.
And so that was where the motivation to first look at super recognizers came from. And of course, we found, yes, there is this distribution. Some of our colleagues in America were the first to look at this as well. And they first introduced this term super recognizers when they found, I think it was 4 individuals who were exceptionally good at face recognition. And then we started to look, and we found a number of people. And once we got that out in the media, suddenly we were contacted by hundreds, I think I can say thousands now, of people who think they could be super recognizers and have taken our tests.
So people are more willing to want to be labelled as a super recognizer.
They are, I think. Yeah, different reasons, I think. And a lot of the earlier work that we did with these super recognizers was very much to try and understand, well, what is it about what they're doing which makes them so good? And if we can understand that, could we actually teach that or change that somehow in people with face blindness? Now, things very quickly moved on because people with more of an interest in forensic psychology actually saw these super recognizers and thought, hang on, these people could actually be really useful to law enforcement, passport control, security, and so on. And the field really jumped on quite quickly then to this possibility, and that there was a much bigger influx of work, and some of that we worked on here at BU was actually exploring whether super recognizers could be of assistance to the police. And here we're talking about really what we alluded to quite early in this conversation, which was we know we're all, unless we have face blindness, most of us are really very good at recognizing people we should know. You know, I'll always recognise you wherever I see you, even if it's unexpected. And that's the same for most people. But what the police are often interested in is trying to identify or recognise somebody that somebody isn't awfully familiar with. So faces that we've rarely come across. So someone might have been caught on CCTV, for example. Is that the same person as this other person caught on this piece of CCTV? If you think about passport control identification. There's thousands of people a day going through a passport control officer's booth, if you like. I don't know that person, but I've got to decide whether this person I've never seen before in front of me matches that photograph. That's really hard.
It seems impossible a lot of the time.
Yeah, it does.
Especially with children, because our youngest, Charlotte's passport, she's our eldest, now looks like what Jessica, I can't remember where's that here. Charlotte's passport photo looks like Jessica looks now.
Right.
Because it's like 2 years old or something. So you look and you go, hang on, that's her.
Wrong child.
Oh, who's the baby then? Yeah. But I suppose they have some leeway, and they probably just think, well, it's unlikely you're going to be smuggling your children across borders or whatever.
Well, and then this led to a broader question, of course, of whether existing passport control officers are actually the best people for the job. Should we be testing people and actually putting super recognisers in here to improve national security and so on?
Who are the people who sit at the passport? Are they part of the police? I don't know. Is that all they do all day? The passport checks?
Yeah, so often they are trained. They would have been through some form of training, but that training isn't necessarily what we would put people through as academics that study face recognition. Often it's more on more practical aspects
Looking
of
serious.
the job, if you like.
It's a really dull job,
Yeah, and there's been some really interesting work which has actually tested the face recognition abilities of people who have been passport control officers for years and years.
Right.
And the findings are quite interesting because people don't get any better with experience. So, and they're no better than if you took a random sample from the general population.
Right.
So again, this, a lot of the work that we've done has shown, well, actually super recognisers would be better at this job.
Yes.
Which raises the broader question of then policy change. Should we be...
They should be using your sort of testing when they interview people for the job, shouldn't they? Probably.
Yeah, but that's a whole new level of policy change and so on.
That also seems to go against what you said earlier about people who grow up in cities are better than, because my assumption when you said that was that, okay, it must be the fact that they encounter lots and lots of faces day in, day out, and why they've improved to that point, whereas the passport control officers who do exactly the same show no better than the average population.
So a couple of points there. I think the growing up bit is key because it's happened during development when we know the brain is more open to change.
Well, maybe they need to put children in passport control.
Maybe.
Train them from a young age. No, I'm joking.
And I think the other thing is, while we're talking about these effects, I should point out they're extremely small. So, the children growing up in small towns versus large towns, we're talking about a very small difference in face recognition ability, whereas a super recognizer versus a typical person is as striking as somebody with face blindness versus a typical person.
I see.
Their skills are off the chart. So, it's quite a different level of ability.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. Again, I'm trying to be too black and white on this big sort of grayscale thing. I know. Don't forget your tea, by the way. It's probably gone cold by now.
Talking so much, I've had the lid on.
So super recognizers. What else was I going to ask about that? There was something else I had on my mind that's now slipped. No, it's gone. Never mind, it'll come back to me, I'm sure. Okay, that's what I wanted to ask you about as well, was your career and how you've progressed, because you progressed fairly quickly at a young age, is that right? And we've had brief conversations about it in the past. So how's that journey been for you? Maybe, tell us a bit about it.
Yeah,
how you got to
sure.
become a professor. I need to stop tapping this mic. This is so bad.
As I said, I started at BU in 2010. So that was my first permanent lectureship position. So I'd previously been at the University of Exeter, where I did 3 degrees. I did my undergraduate degree in psychology, and then at that point I decided I wanted to go down the research route, and I was totally inspired by one of my lecturers who taught me all about prosopagnosia and face blindness, which we thought was really rare actually back then. And he actually gave me the opportunity to do my final year dissertation with an individual that he knew who had face blindness. And that was the moment that made me want to be an academic and want to take that.
What year was that?
Further. So I completed my undergraduate in 2004.
Wow.
So
this is almost 20 years of this subject.
It's going to make me feel old now.
That's phenomenal, though. That's amazing.
So then part of that, the next step of that pathway was to do a master's by research. So I did a research training master's, which then led into the PhD study, all focused on face blindness. And for my PhD, I actually only studied 3 people with face blindness. We thought it was so rare back then. So compared to the studies that we're putting out now, which have hundreds of people, hundreds of participants in them, it shows how far we've come.
That's an amazing success in itself.
Yeah. And a lot of that's thanks to the internet and the media. So that's the cultural change as well that's done that. So I finished my PhD in 2009, and I spent a little bit more time in Exeter postdocing and doing a bit more research. And by that time, my now husband had moved to Bournemouth and got a job. Super recogniser Ben, yeah. And
have you got a T-shirt printed for him yet?
I should get him one, shouldn't I?
It
is his birthday coming up. I could get him that. And Bournemouth is my hometown.
Right.
So there was always a draw to come back to Bournemouth, and Ben got the job here first. He's also an academic, a lecturer, professor now in psychology, but he was a lecturer back then. And so then I got a job and came in, and then seemed to alternate having babies with promotions for a few years. So Ava was born in 2011. Then I got promoted to senior lecturer, and then we had Noah in 2015, and somewhere around there I went up to the grade 9 principal academic, and I think very quickly out of that one I was made an associate professor. My research career was developing very quickly at that time, and BU spotted that and treated me very well with promotions, and had another baby, Finley, in 2017, and came back to be interviewed for the position of professor.
Wow.
So yeah, it did all happen very quickly.
That's the trick then.
Having babies.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But
it hasn't worked for me so far.
You need to have one more. And
yeah,
you'll
mind
be
you, I'm not the
professor.
one actually giving birth to them, am I? Maybe that's the trick. Yeah.
Maybe. And now I'm head of department at the moment for psychology as well, which is a chance to do a bit of leadership and obviously give a little bit back, and I'm enjoying that very much.
So how has that sort of rise through the ranks been for you? Have you encountered difficulties or anything?
I think for me it's probably gone relatively smoothly. I'm very lucky that luck's the wrong word, and I shouldn't use the word luck, because obviously it was hard work. I don't think luck was involved, but I was, should we say, fortunate that I think BU recognised that and rewarded it, and I was encouraged at the right points by those who mentored me to go for promotion when I did. And I think that's so important for women, because often we won't do that for ourselves. We tend to hold back a bit, and sometimes you do need somebody to give you that push and say, actually, you are ready for this. And it doesn't matter if it seems like it wasn't very much time since the last one. Go and fight your case, go and put yourself out there. So that was a really important thing for me, was having, I think, other people to give me the confidence, to give me the pushes I needed to find that, to recognise that in myself. And that's a really important point, because I think we still see that with women throughout academia, that they are a bit more reluctant to put themselves forward for things, and often they do need that push from somebody to give them that confidence to do so. And I think that has been really important in my pathway. So yeah, I think in terms of barriers, I don't think I encountered a barrier in the system or anything like that. I think there's more cultural issues, which I found hard. I did sometimes feel a bit judged by peers, I suppose. as we all know, people have a lot to say about things, and if they don't like what they see in terms of progression, some people are quick to point that out. And resilience, I suppose, is the corporate buzzword that sums that
judged
up.
in what sense, and why do you think? And do you think judged more so than others, or?
I think as a woman, you want to gain your promotion because you deserve it, and not because you're female. And people may feel sometimes women are being pushed along a bit more at the moment because we're trying to close gender pay gaps and for reasons of equality and so on. And I think it's just so important that women realise that they get it because they deserve it, not just because we're trying to meet any corporate goals or so on.
That's I suppose the counter to the positive idea of well, we could call it positive discrimination, is that the people who are being positively discriminated then might have this sort of hanging over them, did I really deserve this, like you say?
Yeah.
That's an interesting point.
I think what's interesting is I certainly felt that at the earlier stages of my career progression, and I didn't feel it later on so much. And maybe that's about me. Maybe that is saying something about me. But I think it's such a shame, because the earlier you are in your career, I think the more vulnerable you are to that sort of thing. And this is quite possibly why we see, a lot of leakage in academia. A lot of women do leave. And then we have these issues around having children and what maternity leave does to hold up your career. And I think for me, I did try to be quite strategic with maternity leave. I tried to sort of keep things going. I really reached out to my collaborators so that I didn't have those gaps in the CV. And you sort of desperately want to stand up in these promotion interviews and say, I've done all this, and despite the fact I was on maternity leave, despite the fact I've had 3 babies, I'm stood here today. But often you're coached along the way to not even acknowledge the fact.
Really?
Certainly back then,
it's almost a natural inequality. To think of it like that just seems corporate and horrible as well. But the fact that the women give birth to the baby and go through that process, and then have a period of time where they need to recover even after the baby has been born, which obviously we have maternity leave for. And then, for that to somehow impact their careers, that's almost like just this natural inbuilt inequality, which I guess we're trying to address these days more and more. But yeah, do you feel like that, like you say, you had to specifically be strategic, which to me, the word strategic and having children doesn't seem like it should maybe go together. You shouldn't have to do that almost.
No.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think we are doing better at that now. So when I had my 3 babies, coming back from maternity leave, I was just straight back into a normal workload. Whereas now, I think most departments, if not all across the institution, actually support some period of, if you like, catch up, where you can just concentrate on your research, say for 6 months or so, before you come back into having a normal teaching workload and so on. And these sorts of initiatives are so important. I think a lot has changed in 10 years, I have to say. I certainly feel a cultural shift. We're absolutely not there yet completely. And these are very difficult issues to work through and answers to find. But I think for me, that planning had to be there. But at the same time, I can't deny that I enjoyed keeping my hand in on research when I was on maternity leave, because I do love what I do. And I did enjoy being able to sort of engage my mind and return to a bit of something for me every now and again. So, I did keep tapped into work during that time. But, I think we just all have to appreciate everyone's going to feel differently about that. And as you approach maternity leave, you don't know what lies ahead for you. You don't know, fingers crossed that you have a healthy child and everything goes swimmingly. But there's so many unknowns.
Yeah.
You don't know how you're going to feel, what your health is going to be like, what your recovery is going to be like, what your birth is going to be. So even all the planning in the world.
How well your baby's going to sleep when
absolutely.
It's born.
Yeah, we all know that one, don't we? So even all the planning in the world, you need life to sort of come your way as well, I think.
Yeah.
And it's, how we handle that in academia and make things easier for women is still very much a work in progress, I think.
There is one thing I'd like to pick up on, which is obviously the pregnancy thing is a specific thing that affects women in a different way, or much more so than for men. But you said earlier that women sometimes don't put themselves forward for progression and this sort of thing. Do you think at the moment that we're in danger of approaching this in this slightly the wrong way? Because I think, and you may well think about this in the same sort of way as I think about it as well, being a psychologist and looking at data and things, is that on, again, this sort of distribution curve thing that we're talking about, if there's the top percentage of people who are super confident and apply for promotions all the time and, just carry themselves in that sort of manner, and then the bottom percentage of people or whatever, and in this middle there's this, in the middle there's this big murky thing. I personally would categorize myself as someone who's not anywhere near the top end of that confidence thing. So I think I'm probably closer to how you would have described women in that sense, not putting myself forward, not feeling like I'm ever quite good enough to do the next thing. So do you think we're in danger of, because our categorizations are too simplistic in terms of male, female, I know there's a whole load of other genders these days as well, but if we just use male and female for now, because that categorization system is oversimplified, that we're actually potentially damaging people who are male, but who also may be in the same sort of boat. They don't feel confident, but there's not those sort of same initiatives. At the moment, it feels like we're going through that a little bit. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, as I said, I'm head of department and I have a very large department. So I've got 80 odd staff. And we're just, of course, entering into promotion season right now. I do think a lot of this actually lies with the leadership in terms of being able to take the initiative and to look at that fairly across, let's say, males and females today. And that's certainly something we do in our department. So we're looking at everybody. We're not just looking at women, we're looking at men as well. How long have some people been in their current role or on their current point on the pay scale? When was their last promotion? What's their performance been over the last year? Because you absolutely do get some people who are ultra reliable. They contribute so much to the department, but they never put their hand up and claim for it. They're the quiet people sometimes.
It's also that subjective thing that I was coming back to earlier. Other than obviously looking around and trying to get a sense of how hard other people are working and what other people are doing, you don't really know, unless you're following everyone around all the time, how much effort everyone else is putting in compared to what you're doing personally. So you never, and I think often you might just have it might be a self-esteem thing or something, that you just naturally feel like you're not as good as other people around you, for example. And even if you're the best person in the department, you will always feel like you're not as good as everybody else. It's just an inbuilt thing. Yeah.
So imposter syndrome, I guess.
That's one way of putting it, isn't it? The imposter syndrome thing.
Yeah, and it's definitely something I've experienced. I think I still do. And, people, again, take different perspectives on this. I mean, I've had somebody I've spoken to about it who I really respect, senior mentor, who said to me, well, actually, the day you lose your imposter syndrome is the day it all goes wrong. Because you're constantly challenging, you're constantly looking in yourself and trying to be better and so on.
So it's actually a tool to improve because you're constantly reflecting inward. But it is quite debilitating at times as well.
It is. I'm not sure. I see where that perspective comes from. I mean, my imposter syndrome's definitely got better as I've probably as I've got older rather than as I've got more senior, I think.
Is it to do with your work as well, though, and your competencies and things like that? I mean, you've got a massive back catalogue of evidence now that says you are, amazing at what you do.
Well, that's very kind of you. Yeah, it's. I think it's more than that. I think, we are more vulnerable at certain life stages, and probably more vulnerable to feeling things like imposter syndrome. I think if we just go back to women, for example, of course it's going to be surrounding pregnancy. You are at your most vulnerable there. You strip it back to hormones, whatever you want to put on it. Of course you are. But the same will apply to men at different, life stages as well. And I think, I suppose it's coming back to this word resilience, and I don't really like corporate buzzwords like that. But
it was just a word before it was a corporate buzzword.
It was, yeah. But resilience is something I've learnt in more recent years, and I don't know if becoming a parent is maybe something that's helped me with that, because it's hardened me in terms of being if one of my kids needs something, don't fight me, because I'll be there for my child, and that's the end of it.
So you've grown an inner strength.
I've grown an inner strength,
knowing
which
that you have people who depend on you.
And that's transferred, that then ability to stand up for things and for my child, and that's transferred to other aspects of my life. And there is something, I think, to do with becoming older as well. Maybe that feeds into it too. But it's so important, because if you're your own worst enemy, I think, if you're the one that's always almost holding yourself back and being overly self-critical, and I know what that feels like. I've definitely been there, and I still get flashes of it now. You've got to learn a skill to actually just reset yourself and sort of say, well, okay, that's okay. I
think something that I've done in the past is I don't really like the word perfectionist, because it implies that I think I'm perfect in some way, but that's what a lot of people call it, is when you overly fuss about one particular thing because it's your thing, it's the thing that you've put all your work into, and then because you're analysing it so deeply and so much, it seems somehow not as good before you analysed it so intricately, if that makes sense. So I think if you apply that too much to life, it could be quite debilitating. I mean, just the experience of making this podcast, for example, my natural thing, I wanted to have like 3 cameras here, for example, and lights so we could cut between, but then that's just way too much workload. And it took me a while before I started making this podcast to just say, actually, it's better to just do something rather than do it perfectly. And that's, I think, a big lesson in terms of just keep moving forward, keep doing things even if you think it's not as good as it could be.
I think so. And I think it comes back to this idea of what I was saying about trying to keep things going while I was on maternity leave. My approach was very much, I'm not going to see a reduction in the number of things I output. So how am I going to manage this now I have children? Well, actually, I'm going to lower the standard of what I see as acceptable. So I have put less time into it now. And I think 2 things happened. I learned to work a lot more efficiently, and that comes with experience and age and all the above. But the second is you have to it's this perfectionism thing. You have to lower your threshold for what is acceptable. And one of the things that also helps with that, I think, is the more you start looking at other people's work, and in academia, that's very normal. So from a research perspective, I review a lot of papers. I'm a journal editor. I do an awful lot of that. You see this in other people as well. You start to realise you don't need to be perfect. And you just need to get something over the line. You shut it off, and you realise then I can have the most impact on people, on life, on society, on my research field. The more broader I go, the more outputs that I can give than if I just focused on getting this one thing word perfect. And I think that sort of links again to another concept, which is that of role models. And this is something that's I've given a lot of thought to over the last year since I've become head of department, because quite a few people have said to me that they see me as a role model. Now, my natural reaction to that is, what are you talking about? I'm not a role model. I'm not good enough to be your role model. The old imposter syndrome sort of coming straight back in. And then I started to realise that if you can bring it to yourself to accept you are a role model, it's actually a very powerful thing, and it's a very privileged thing. And if you can find that confidence to say, okay, so I'm a role model, some people see me as a role model, I can actually use this and I can have a bigger impact, I can help more people. And if I can now accept I am good at what I do, and I accept some people see me as a role model, how can I now start to give that back? And I think that's something that I've really has brought the enjoyment to me out of moving into leadership and becoming a head of department, is that I've started to accept that other people see me like that. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way at all.
I don't think anyone will be thinking that, Sarah, don't worry.
But I've realised the privilege that comes with that. And I've realised the time that I can give to people to try and help them, and particularly to women, because that's an issue that's really close to my heart, especially, women going through that period of having children like I did. It's that I can't really put it into words, but it's something which has made me feel, okay, if I can now accept this in myself, I realise the power that and the impact I can give back to other people. Does
it also on some level force you to carry yourself differently, because you suddenly think now, okay, people are looking up to me, so I need to be this sort of, maybe not hero, that's a bit of a strong word, but you know how the superheroes puff their chest out and I am in control of this situation. Does it force you to do a bit of that as well, and sort of take charge in meetings and things like this, because people are looking up to you to inspire them to do the same one day?
Yeah, I mean, I have to chair my fair share of meetings, that's for sure. I'd hope I'd always actually remain approachable, and that's, as a leader, that's quite a big deal to me. I'd hope I wouldn't actually change in that way, so that people can feel they can come and talk to me and approach me. I think retaining the fact that you're human is important, but it's also giving out. One of the things I've really tried to bring to the way I lead in my department is the importance for transparency on everything, for equality, for diversity, the way we try and include everybody, the opportunities for everybody to be heard, to feel that they've contributed in some ways. And it's all what I would like to see in a good leader. I try and be myself, and I think that is actually in openness, transparency, making sure you're approachable, and that door's always open to the people that you're trying to lead effectively. And there's no better feedback than when, I have to say, the days when people said to me, "You're my role model," I wanted to run away and cry, because it was just the most lovely thing. Wow. And I think you're doing your job well, but it can. I think, I don't know how well I'm putting this across, but there's once you realise there's a responsibility to snap yourself out of imposter syndrome and realise other people see me as this, if I can just accept it in myself.
I think that's maybe what I was trying to ask. Yeah. You have now a responsibility to show other people how it's done. Yeah,
and you've got to pull yourself out of that sort of denial and that trying to be modest, I suppose, or whatever, to channel that in the right way, not through an arrogant pathway, but through okay, if I accept I am this person and people do see me like that, how can I now give that back?
It's quite a big British trait, I think, isn't it, to Probably. Sort of put ourselves down, and we quite like the underdog, don't we? Whereas if you look at America and how they approach things in sport, it's just like, yeah, come on, yeah, all this. Maybe I'm just looking at a select few Americans when I make that judgment, but it seems very much the opposite thing, doesn't it, where they celebrate the individual a lot more, and themselves a lot more. So you must read and write a lot, I imagine. That's my perception of to become a professor and to do the amount of
I'm
research
doing my
you've
best.
done. Have you always read from an early age? What was your sort of childhood like growing up? Were you a bookworm or?
I was,
Yeah.
probably the worst bookworm ever. Yeah, I loved to read, and my childhood ambition was actually to be a writer, to be an author of fiction.
Really?
That was always what I wanted to do. And then all the way through school, to be honest, that was what I was thinking. I suppose at the school I went to, we were sort of pushed into thinking about more formal pathways to careers than
You
just becoming an author.
In Bournemouth, didn't you?
I did,
Was it
Bournemouth School for Girls.
Yes,
yeah.
And I went to the boys' school, but we were different years.
There you go.
Ben did as well, didn't he? Your
No,
husband? Oh, I thought he did.
no, he wasn't local.
Right.
So yeah, and I sort of picked psychology just as thinking about becoming maybe a practicing clinical psychologist, but that once I got to university and experienced more of the subject, it was very much my academic sort of inclinations, I suppose, quite quickly took over. I was always very studious. I enjoyed doing assignments at school. So becoming a scientist and becoming an academic, I suppose it was always there from when I was about 2 or 3.
Really?
People could have spotted it. Yeah.
That seems to be a commonality. I ask most people who come on this podcast, do you read and write a lot? And it seems like everyone from an early age really enjoys reading and, has that sort of approach to get to that level of research outputs.
I remember handing in my last assignment as a student and thinking, what am I going to do now? I'm never going to write another essay. And I just, and I think...
As a school student?
As an undergraduate, actually.
Oh, right.
And sit in the last exam and then I was like, masters, that's fine. I can carry on doing doing that sort of thing. And then I was like, there's this career in academia. People will actually pay me to keep on writing things, like essays and scientific papers. I do it for free. It's what I love. So, yeah, it was always there, I think. I just had to find the subject I wanted to put it on.
So maybe the lesson is do what you love and you never work a day in your life.
Maybe that's it.
So what does the future hold for you? What's coming up next? Are you going to write another book, maybe?
Well, you planted a seed, actually, today. Maybe it is time for a second edition or a new project. I'm enjoying my head of department time at the moment and very much enjoying being on the leadership side of things, which, as I say, has been quite new for me, for this level of leadership over the last year. And I thought I was going to hate it. So it was a lovely surprise that I actually have really enjoyed that. So I do want to further explore that side of things. And I'd love to make the psychology department at Bournemouth University, as best as we probably can and attract as many top researchers and students to us as we can.
Well, I think you've done a pretty good job of making it fairly well renowned already with the work on prosopagnosia, I must say.
Oh, that's very kind. You're being very kind to me in this interview, Tom.
I'm always kind, surely. I mean, you've I don't know if it's still on the mural, or is it? Or was it the old one?
They changed it now. I think it was the old one.
But it had like a sort of a face with the biometric lines on it or something.
Yeah.
Is that what you call them? I don't know.
Yeah.
My terminology is probably off, but you made it on the mural.
I made it to the mural.
At Bournemouth University on the
campus. I had my face outside Pool House reception once as well on the door, which was great. My kids thought it was hilarious. I found it very embarrassing.
It's a certain level of fame, I suppose.
Yeah, but I think research-wise, I've still got so much to give and so much to do, and it's endless. I love what I do. I love writing and want to make more time for it, which I think I can do. Obviously, coming back from the pandemic, we've slightly changed the way of working as well.
Okay.
And that was, as you know, actually, because you, of course, came in to the lab, didn't you, to take part in some of our work when we were really struggling to get participants during the latter stages.
Was that the one where we had to watch episodes of an Australian?
That's
was it?
Right.
An Australian soap, which I hate soaps, by the way. So thanks for putting me through that. It's soap opera, and then we had to see if we could. Am I sharing too much if I say this? Because what if people?
No.
Okay.
No, it's fine. No, we finished.
Oh, you finished that one?
Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't a super recogniser, by the way, which I was very disappointed about. Yeah. But yeah, we basically had to watch a soap opera. Was it sort of? I can't remember how many episodes we watched.
So it's So you did the binge watching bit, didn't you?
Oh, where I
so
just come in and watch it. That was right.
That's right.
Yeah. But other people had to watch it at home. Didn't
That's
they?
right. So you did it over 5 days, and you watched 10 minutes of this program a day. And then we tested your face recognition each day on the characters, and we were looking to see how that grows. So we completed the data collection, but we haven't done the analysis yet on that one. So so I can't comment on the findings.
I can tell you something that I feel like I learned from that process, which is I'm fairly reductionist when it comes to faces. And I think we actually spoke about this before in terms of different races or skin colours, for example. Growing up in a very white area really down here in Dorset, it seems, and this also could be the basis of most racism, I suppose, in life, but it seems like easier to just categorise of, that Asian man on that program or something, and then when you get like 2 or 3 of characters who have a similar skin tone, it then becomes, you don't recognise those apart as well as you do the other people. And I think we have spoken before about this idea that people recognise and have finer distinctions between people of their own race compared to others. Is that,
yeah. So this is really well published in the psychological literature. So it's what we call the other ethnicity effect in face recognition.
Right.
And there's various potential hypotheses or explanations for why this might happen. So basically, we're better at recognising faces from our own ethnicity compared to those of others. And some people see that as quite a social psychological phenomenon. So it's something to do with the way we're classing people as our in-group versus our out-group, and that actually transfers onto our cognitive performance in face recognition. But it actually comes down to that social categorization rather than something perceptual, if you like, or visual that we're doing. Whereas other people see it as more of like a visual expertise effect. So for like what you're saying, you grew up locally where, very much you see mostly white people around. That's where your visual system has grown its expertise because it's had much more contact with people from that ethnicity. And you've had much less experience at distinction between, say, black people or Asian people. And that, going back to what we talked about right at the start of this, about whether the brain can change and become more fine-tuned to face recognition. Well, this other ethnicity effect actually says, and for certain types of faces, that fine-tuning can occur.
So if you go and live in a different culture with different races, you would become more adept at...
So there's mixed evidence on that, but the suggestion would be if you did it as a child...
As a child again.
You'd be likely to. Mixed evidence as to how that happens with adults. Yeah. But yeah, certainly, large bodies of work there. So yeah, in the study that you did for us, we had, I think, various ethnicities actually in that particular pool of faces. So yeah.
It's also a tricky subject, right? Because I think in the past you've advertised for a certain race. Am I right in thinking you weren't allowed to do that or something like that? It was sort of put a stop to. Yeah.
It was where we were advertising through sort of Central University comms. They sort of felt they didn't really want us to do that, which is fine. And as researchers, you can deal with these things in different ways, and you understand why the university wouldn't want to be too selective.
It's a really tricky sort of topic at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Race and gender, I suppose, are both sort of touchy subjects.
But it's really interesting, I think, in the field of face recognition, very traditionally and up to quite recently, we've always been very careful to control everything we do. So you might say, well, I'm only going to use white participants for this particular study because we know about this other race, other ethnicity bias that goes on. So let's hold everything constant. Let's just have white faces in the stimuli for the test, if you like. We'll just use white participants. But you're actually seeing a bit of a push in very recent months, really, last year or so, to people saying, well, come on, look, things have changed. we do now. Most of us live in a multicultural society. We don't need to be controlling things quite to this extent, and this doesn't even reflect everyday face recognition experiences anyway, where we could be recognizing faces of any ethnicity and so on. So we're certainly starting to see a cultural shift in how scientists are taking this approach, to one that's moving away from this very, very careful controlling thing to actually saying, well, why don't we just do things like how the real world is?
Well, that's true, yeah. But I mean, when you say science in a laboratory, I always think of controlling as many variables as you possibly can and changing one thing at a time. So does that not go against that sort of principle?
I think it just depends how you look at it. I think the problem is then if you're drawing conclusions based on just that sample of people who are representative now of only a certain sample of the population, can we then make our conclusions generalised to everybody else? Whereas if we're just open in the first place, I think this is where this argument comes from, we're actually talking about society as a whole, and that what we're researching here is generalisable to wider society. So I think it's the way it will go.
Cool.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting different strands from what you would think is a very narrow niche topic, prosopagnosia and face blindness, but lots of strands of it, the super recognisers, the face blind people, the people who have acquired, and what we were just talking about as well with different cultures and all this sort of stuff. It seems like a really fascinating area of research, and I suppose that's why it's captivated you. Is that the right word? That's not the right word, is it?
No, it is.
Captivated you for 20 years almost.
Yeah, you make
Do I
me
need to
feel
stop
old
saying
every
that?
time you say that. Oh, have I been doing that for being an adult for 20 years?
But yeah, just amazing stuff. So thank you so much for talking to me on the podcast. Have you got any final advice or anything you'd give to maybe junior academics or anything like that, or maybe people who are considering getting into the world of academia? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think
don't do it. Yeah.
No, well, that is exactly my advice. Is a lot of people will say that. But I would say don't let that put you off. I think academia is getting a bad press at the moment for all sorts of reasons. But there's also so many positives. And, every day I think, people, how silly is the university paying me to do something I do for free? And how many people can, generally say they go to work to do a job that inspires them and that they love. And I think, academia is a job where you can have so much positive impact as well. And if, you're at those early stages of your career where it does feel like such a struggle, I would say don't give up and to reach out and try and get some help through, because you will get through it, and it does get easier as you move on.
Inspiring words. It's inspirational to speak with someone who's so passionate about what they do as well.
I'm flattered, Tom.
I've
flattered
overflattered
for this
you.
whole thing.
I'll take it all back when I stop the camera. No, I'm joking. Thank you so much, Professor Sarah Bate.
It was a pleasure.
It's been wonderful chatting today.